welcome. Is it on? So welcome, and thank you all for being here at this special Age of Health event, both in person and I know many, many more meeting us online. My name is Anne Pollock, and I'm the head of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London, and it is such an honor to be here today to introduce and share this conversation between a pair of luminaries in the domain of health inequalities. We have two esteemed professors with us today. Doing any justice at all to their CVs would take the whole evening all by itself, and so I'll keep the introductions short. Professor Sir Michael Marmot has been Professor of Epidemiology at the University College London since 1985, and he is Director of the UCL Institute for Health Equity. He is the author of The Health Gap, The Challenge of an Unequal World, and The Status Syndrome. Marmot has led research groups on health inequalities for nearly 50 years. He chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, several WHO regional commissions, and reviews on tackling health inequality for governments in the UK. He served as the president of the British Medical Association from 2010 to 2011, and as president of the World Medical Association in 2015. Camara Phyllis Jones, MD, MPH, PhD, is a family physician, epidemiologist, and past president of the American Public Health Association, whose work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on health and well-being in the United States and the world. She is celebrated for her allegories on race, racism, teaching stories which illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for many people to understand or discuss. She is currently a Leverhulme visiting professor in my department, the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure for us that she's spending the 22-2023 academic year focused on building research capacity in the area of racism and health at King's and here in the UK more broadly. So thank you both all for your decades of path-breaking work and for being here with us today. We hope that this will be a dynamic and engaging conversation. To get us into things, Professors Marmot and Jones will each give short 8-minute presentations, followed by a conversation. As they engage with each other's interventions, I may contribute a few questions along the way, and we will also welcome questions from the audience. Then at the end, we'll have a couple of minutes of concluding thoughts from each. One note of housekeeping is that you'll notice that we're filming and photographing the event, and so if you don't consent to having your image presented, please be sure to be in touch with our comms person, Meghna, and we'll make sure that that's accommodated. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Michael.
Thank you. Often I get asked, what's the one thing you would recommend? I've written reports with a series of recommendations, and then I get asked, what's the one thing you'd recommend? One thing, put equity of health and well-being at the heart of all government policy. So when the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe was holding a meeting on the well-being economy and asked me to attend, these days, post-pandemic, my first response is no, I don't travel anymore, but had my arm twisted. And what I want to say now is, in a way, my reactions to the conversation about the well-being economy. People are pretty shell-shocked. Austerity, global financial crisis, pandemic, war in Europe. The tyranny of the urgent present distracts us from the important, urgent task of building a better long-term future. When I did my first English review, one of the recommendations we made was about reading to children. And I was presenting my report in the northeast of the country to a group of chief executives of local government. And when they heard this recommendation of reading to children, one chief executive leapt to her feet and said, "What are we waiting for? We should implement this afternoon." So when should we start building the better society? This evening? Tonight, I think, would be a good time to start, maybe tomorrow morning, but not later than that. So yes, we've got to deal with these urgent problems. But I've been hearing for 50 years, don't tell me about the long term. We've got a fire raging, we've got to put it out. Now is the time to start putting it out. And I heard a great deal in WHO Euro because WHO is managed by ministers of health. So I heard a great deal about we've got to get better health in order to get economic growth. I've been hearing this argument for a very long time. Yeah, good, if you think that'll make you feel good, and if you can make the argument that better health will contribute to economic growth, fine, make the argument. It may even be true. But that's not the reason to be concerned with health inequalities. There's a much more important reason, and that's the moral reason. If people suffer ill health through no fault of their own, but through the circumstances in which they are born, grow, live, work, and age, and inequities of power, money, and resources, the social determinants of health, that's quite wrong. That's unjust. I don't want to steal your thunder by quoting Martin Luther King, but if I may, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. There's the moral reason for addressing health inequalities. Is there any money to do what I want to do? That's always the question. Isn't all this going to cost a lot? I was approached last week by North East London Integrated Care Board. They spend £4 billion a year to deliver healthcare for 2 billion people. That's $4.8 billion. WHO budget globally is $3.8 billion a year. So the Global Public Health Agency has a smaller budget than the North East London authority with responsible for healthcare. There's a lot of money sloshing about. We've just got to decide how we want to spend it. And I think we're spending it the wrong way. So let me say 3 things which I think should be the way forward. The first is to rediscover public purpose. Gary Gerstle, in his magisterial history, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, notice the rise and fall of the neoliberal order, says that the New Deal began with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, who recognized that capitalism left to itself led to the kind of problems he could see all around him in the Great Depression. Huge inequality, crises of overproduction and decline and so on. And he wanted to save capitalism from itself and introduced regulations, public investment, the common good. And that lasted until, in Britain, 1979, with the election of Margaret Thatcher, 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan. And the pendulum swung. Now, they said, you can't leave things to government. They mess everything up. The market will solve everything. And what did that lead to? a hollowing out of the public sector, a failure to recognize the importance of the public good. I reviewed for The Lancet, if you want to read it, 2 weeks ago, Mariana Mazzucato's latest book, The Big Con. Globally, you ready for this? Globally, we spend on consultancies somewhere between $700 billion a year and $900 billion a year on consultancies. And as she and her co-author, Rosie Collington, say, the consultancies surf the wave of neoliberalism, a distrust of the public sector. If you're a consultant, even if we have to pay you 5 times as much, you must be better at doing this than a dedicated public servant. It's somehow a complete distrust of public service. We need to rediscover the common good. We need to rediscover the public sector and public purpose. The second major thing is intergenerational equity, equity between the generations. I'm really struck by a Gallup survey that asked people, do you think the next generation will have a better life than the current generation? And in Slovenia, the majority said, no, the current generation will not have a better life. In Italy, in Sweden, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in France, in Czech, Belgium, Austria, in country after country, the current generation thinks we screwed it up for the next generation. We did this. What we bequeath to the next generation is a worse condition of life than we had. And they're right. We're publishing a report for Norway on Friday this week, and they didn't have that question that we've looked at, but young people saying the future will get better. Huge social gradient. Young people with more education think the future, they've got a bright future. With less education, they don't. And think about social mobility. The calculation has been done that in Denmark, it will take 2 generations for today's low-income people to have the income of the median. In Norway, Finland, Sweden, it'll take 3 generations. In the UK and Italy and some other countries, it'll take 5 generations for people of low income to have the median. In Brazil, it'll take 9 generations. And we know why there's such a difference. Investing in reducing child poverty, in early child development, will make a real difference. And I looked at these representatives from 53 European countries and said, okay, do you want to be more like Denmark or more like Brazil? In the UK, we've decided we want to be more like Brazil. We're going to make things harder for our children, and particularly if they're children of people on universal credit. We're going to increase child poverty, reduce spending on education. We want to be more like Brazil. Wow. And the third point that I want to make is we know what to do. We know what to do to put it right. In my English review and variety in the different European, Eastern Mediterranean, American reviews, we talk about early child development, education, employment and working conditions, having enough money to have a healthy life, healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work, and taking a social determinants approach to prevention. And latterly, I've added 2 more. Deal with discrimination, racism, and their consequences, and pursue the climate change and the health equity agenda together. We know what to do. We have the resources to do it. What we need is the will. And the time to start doing it is this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And it is my pleasure to follow you in this. You may have heard in Professor Pollock's introduction of me that my work is on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of my nation, the US, and then your nation, the UK, where I am right now, and the world. And I imagine that there are many people in this room right now who aren't used to hearing the word racism or saying the word racism every day or every week or every month or ever. So I thought that I would spend my introductory remarks giving you a frame for understanding what race is and isn't, and then talking about what racism is. And I say this just by backdrop because racism is foundational in the history and wealth of the United States. It is foundational in the wealth and the history of the UK, of the United Kingdom, and yet in both of our countries, many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. And some people express that staunch denial by saying racism doesn't exist. There are laws going all over across the states in the US. All of this anti-critical race theory stuff is really racism denial laws, right? And there are examples even in your Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report that was released in 2021, where they said structural racism. They were looking at all of the differences in health outcomes and educational outcomes and police encounters and all, but said that structural racism had nothing to do with it. So that's one way to be about racism denial. Another way is to never say the word racism in the context of widespread racism denial. So my whole work is to equip people to say that racism exists, racism is a system, racism saps the strength of the whole society, and we can act to dismantle racism. So I'm right there with you in terms of action. So let me back up and just say, why am I, as a physician, a medical doctor trained in 2 specialties, a PhD epidemiologist who in university never took one sociology course or anthropology course or political science course because I was a molecular biology major, why have I devoted my career for the past several decades on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of our nations and the world? I could give you 3 hours of why, but basically, as an epidemiologist, and as a person, like many of us now, since 2020, with the advent of COVID around the world, and in the UK and in the US, the very marked and surprising to many people racial disparities in terms of morbidity and mortality, people dying more, and people were like, oh my God, right? What's going on with these health disparities here? We're saying, oh, maybe there's something structural going on. But the same thing could be said about infant mortality differences by race in our nation, or maternal mortality differences, or mental health diagnoses and treatment in the UK, or incarceration in the US, and so on and so forth. So as an epidemiologist, long interested, not just with COVID, but long interested in understanding the basis of race-associated differences in health outcomes, had to figure out, what does this variable race measure? Now, if we were to do a survey among epidemiologists or people on the street or people in a room about what does the variable race measure, we would get generally some combination of, it's measuring some combination of social class, culture, and genes. So I would like to briefly critique race as a measure of each of those and then introduce something else into the mix. So when people say race and social class, maybe race is measuring social class. It's because they observe that both in the US and in the UK, people of color are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in those two countries are overrepresented in wealth. But it is true that not all people of color in the US or the UK are poor, and it is also true that in the UK, the majority of poor people are white, and in the US, the plurality now, used to be the majority, but now the plurality of all the groups, the biggest group, the plurality of poor people in the US are white. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence between social class, say poverty, and race. So if anything, race is a rough proxy for social class, and there's any kind of relationship at all only because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors in our laws, customs, background norms, and the way that structural racism very often shows up these days is indifference and inaction in the face of need. But so that was my critique of race and social class. Race, if anything, is a rough proxy for social class, and only a proxy to the extent that it manifests the impacts of structural racism. But what about culture? Race as a proxy for culture. Well, first of all, so I'm going to speak from the US and then I'm come over to the UK. Okay. So there, people who are called black or white or Asian or Hispanic, there is no one culture within any of those groups, right? And people, for example, who are called black may have been raised in the rural South or the urban North, or just immigrated from Haiti or Jamaica, or just immigrated from Nigeria or Ethiopia, and have very different dietary practices, health beliefs in all cultures. This is true among people who are called Hispanic or Latino, who come from all different, people who are called Asian, and in the US, Asian is East and Southeast Asian, right? So China, Korea, Japan, all of these, and people who are called white. Many different cultures, right? In the UK, that is also true. You guys do a thing here where you do kind of a race ethnic thing. So then you say black Caribbean, black African, black other, black British, right? I don't know the order in there, right? And then Asian, you say, okay, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, whatever. But really, the thing that is called race, which I'm going to get to, that on the street classification, doesn't even make those distinctions. Furthermore, here in the UK, even if you were talking about one group, let's say Indian, you have the generational differences in culture and all. So what I'm saying is race is not a good predictor of culture either, that the categories that we call race have many ethnicities in them. They have many, people are born with ancestry, with cultural ancestry, with genetic ancestry, with, parents and grandparents and history and language. But we clump them all into races, which doesn't capture culture at all. So race is a rougher proxy for culture. So then you say, oh, yeah, but I got you, Dr. Jones. What about race as a proxy for genes? Well, I got you. We have mapped the human genome. There is no basis in the human genome for racial subspeciation. Although many people in the lay public in the US, and I would say maybe in the UK too, believe that race is biology. That is not the case. We are here in a medical school, so I hope there are no medical students in here who have that. But I hope there are no people in the general public who have that idea. Now, you say, but Dr. Jones, there's genetic variability on the planet. Indeed, there is. There's genetic variability in this room. There's genetic variability in our families. But the pie slicer that we call race does not capture that genetic variability. So, Dr. Jones, what did you say? Race is a rough proxy for social class, rougher for culture, meaningless for genes. Then why do we see these persistent racial health disparities in both of our countries? So what is it really measuring? Race is the social classification of people in a race-conscious society. It is a social interpretation of how we look that is the substrate on which racism operates day to day and has operated for centuries in both of our countries. That is, the same race that a medical admitting clerk in an emergency department in the US or an A&E in the UK, somebody comes in unconscious, I don't know if they even get a race or you have to speak your race here, I don't know. But in the US, they would mark off a race, right? That same race, which becomes part of a health statistic, is the same race that a police officer notices, or a taxi driver, or a teacher in a classroom, or a judge in a courtroom. And it is that race that has profound impacts on our life opportunities, life experiences, and the like. So I am saying that my interest in understanding race-associated differences in health outcomes, these racial and ethnic health disparities, led me to figure out what is that variable race measuring, because I am, after all, a scientist. And that variable race is a rough proxy for social class, rougher for culture, meaningless for genes, but precisely captures the impacts of racism in a race-conscious society. And furthermore, if you want to measure social class, you should measure social class. Don't use race as a proxy, as we do in the US. I know you guys are much better here. If you want to measure culture, measure culture. Don't use race as a proxy for culture. If you want to measure genes, for sure, measure genes. Don't use race as a proxy. If you want to understand racism, then socially assigned race, street race, I don't have time to go into that, but that, without asking how do you self-identify, that race that we're all checking off for each other as we look around the room, that is the substrate on which racism operates daily. So I'm going to conclude my remarks briefly by defining racism. I'm going to say it in one sentence, and then I'm going to just lift up the things and sit down, and we are going to talk. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, parentheses, which is what we call race, close parentheses, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. What I want to pick up in that definition are four things. Racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw. It's not a personal moral failing. It's not a psychiatric illness, as some people suggested, although yes, it can manifest in all of those ways and more. But in its essence, racism is a system of power. A system of doing what? That's the next thing I want to pick up. A system of doing two things, structuring opportunity and assigning value. The third thing I want to pick up, on what basis is the opportunity structured and the value assigned? Based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. In most parts of the US, I'm clearly black. In some parts of Brazil, I'm just as clearly white. In South Africa, I'm just as clearly colored. If I stayed in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all those places. And I'm saying for every single person in this room, there's some other place on this earth where your so-called race is different from how you're living it today. So it's not just my appearance. What's the fourth thing I want to lift up? That racism has three impacts. When people think about racism, they just think the one impact, if they finally recognize that racism exists, if they get beyond the racism denial, and that is that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. We can talk about that. And then finally, the third impact, racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So I will say, I will join Professor Sir Michael Marmot, my friend, in saying we all need to recognize that, and maybe that impact is what is going to give all of us a sense of urgency to dismantle this system, racism, and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So thank you.
So thank you so much for your inspiring and insightful comments. Before kind of opening it up, I wonder if you have any comments for each other or reflection.
I had two things. I wanted to say amen when you were talking about starting today. That sense of urgency that I was talking about. And I think that sometimes people go for the low-hanging fruit, right? And people go for the low-hanging fruit because if they're funding something they want to get credit as a politician or a funder or whatever. So I was wondering, what do we do? What do we do about that reticence to do what I describe as planting an acorn today so that our grandchildren can have shade? How do we, you're up in the stratosphere in terms of talking to policymakers nationally and globally, what do we say really to bring that home?
That's an easy one. I've been pushing this argument for a long time. My first question to policymakers is, what are you here to do? And if they're honest, it may be to get rich, to massage my ego, to give favors to my friends, or whatever. But actually, with some exceptions, in my experience, the closer you get to these people, the more they are reasonable people, with some signal exceptions, like a couple of former prime ministers of recent.
Presidents.
The closer you get to them, the more people hate them. The people who really know them really hate them because they're ghastly people. But that's not true of most of them. And so the first thing is, I think, inside most of these politicians and policymakers is a decent person trying to get out. And I try and appeal to their decency. What are you here to do? And surely some part of you says the reason you came into politics is that you wanted to improve things for the population. I've already talked about the low level, getting rich, corrupt, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult to deal with people who are corrupt all the way through. So there's no basis for conversation. But there is a basis for conversation for people, some part of whom wants to focus on the greater good. Now, I can remember talking to senior government people in Australia, and I said, don't tell me that your politicians are focused only on the next election. I don't want to hear that. I know you've got it on a hotkey on your computer. I won't do anything unless it improves our chances at the next election. I want to hear that you've got a vision for the future. And some do respond to that.
Do you have a question for me? Because I could go back, but I don't want to just interview you.
Yeah. Well, in a way, you've answered my question, because when I first wrote about race in America, I said, you could explain most of it on socioeconomic characteristics, that the way race operates is the fact that people tend to end up in lower socioeconomic positions. And that's not to deny the existence of racism, but to say that's how it operates. And I like to think my view has evolved. And I only wish that I'd met you sometime earlier. It wouldn't have taken me so long to get there. So in a way, my challenge for you is, how do we get your understanding, the way you put it, it's not a good proxy for any of those three things. It's correlated with some, the first two, but not the third one. But the way you defined racism, of these four things, how do we get that understanding in a country like Britain, which has been denying the very existence of racism? And a government commission, as you said.
Right.
I'm being attacked personally, by the way, by the head of that commission. He's got a bee in his bonnet about me. I mean, it's really odd. This African origin chair of a commission that denies racism is attacking a white scientist who says racism is rife in our society and we've got to address it. How do we get your understanding over here?
Well, you can introduce me to him.
I like you too much.
No. Okay, so at one level, I do a lot of my communication. Here I chose not to start with one of my stories because I thought everybody's not at the level of even saying the word racism, so But I do a lot of my teaching through allegory, and Actually, may I share? Okay, first of all, I'm going to share a quick story. It's about 5 or 6 minutes. My graphics are very handmade, like old school, so don't judge me, okay, on my graphics. But I actually, I think they said that it's here. Oh, it is, okay. So to answer your question, it's through allegory and through meeting people and understanding and not judging people. But really, I want to meet those people. I mean, I actually sent to Anne an email. I was like, how do I meet those people? How do I meet various decision makers? Because in 2 hours, I can have people with light bulbs going off. Now, they may choose to bury the light bulbs later. They may choose not to act. But I can get people to understand things that they were blind to before. So this story, so there are 4 key messages when naming racism. The first is that racism exists. And I say that's a key message because there's so much racism denial. The second is that racism is a system. The third is that racism saps the strength of the whole society. And the fourth is that we can act to dismantle racism. This story, which should take about 6 minutes, is my story I tell when I want to equip people who either their whole life has said, this is the land of equal opportunity, there's no racism here, you know, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. To help them understand that, yes, racism exists, even though their whole life experience and teaching has said no. And for those people who already know that racism exists, to equip you with a communication tool to help talk to others about it. This is based on my own real life experience, and I don't know if you can just hear it. I don't know if you guys want to turn around. No, yeah, well, okay.
Go for it.
So, this real life experience, I was a medical student, like some of you guys in this room. My first year in medical school, very diligent, very studious, woke up on a Saturday morning and hit the books and hit them hard, was studying. It was mid-afternoon, and some of my friends came over. Now, they were also medical students, so did they distract me from my studies? No. We all got to studying together, long and hard. And now it was getting late, and we were getting hungry. And I had no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends actually understood. They were like, okay, never mind, Camara. We know you don't have food in the apartment, but we're hungry. Let's go into town and find something to eat. So this story, which I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, is about what happened next. So we go into town, we find a restaurant. We walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served. Here we are eating. Not a very remarkable story that racism exists, right? Hold on. As I sat there with my friends eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation about racism. So now I hope I've intrigued you and you're wondering, well, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Come on. What does the sign say? The sign said open. So now I know I've lost some of you. How is a sign that says open a startling revelation about racism? So let me recap. Here we are in a restaurant eating, sitting at the table eating. I look up, I see a sign that says open, thinking no more about it. I assume other hungry people can walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed the restaurant was now closed, due to the hour, but firmly closed. But that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open-closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans and white Brits to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege, especially in the early part of COVID, even though we were living it so large with how much of the COVID-19 vaccine we were sequestering in our nation. Now, those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door, let them come in? You'll make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you do is pass some food through the window, or maybe you try to tear down the sign or break through the door, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. I'll just take one more minute to say, these days, people who just 2.5 years ago might have been sitting inside the restaurant eating and craning to say, what are those people outside saying? Black lives matter. Don't they know all lives matter? Are now saying, proclaiming Black lives matter. More people who were born inside the restaurant are now saying the word racism, putting together the phrases structural racism, systemic racism. That is important. But here is my warning. If we just say a thing, it's important to say the word racism because you have to name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But if that's all you do, if you just put something on your institutional webpage or you tweet something out or Facebook, whatever you're doing, 6 months from today, we who have named racism, 6 months from today, we are at risk of forgetting why we said that word. Because racism denial is so staunchly held by so many, and it's so seductive that 6 months from now, we may fall into what I describe as, the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond naming racism to action, which means we have to tear down the sign. And of course, racism is not just a sign, it's a door, it's a lock, there's a whole system going on. We have to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges, because once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. So I hope you can remember elements of that story and carry it on. Thank you for that opening.
Let's welcome some questions from the audience. So we have some volunteers with mics here who can take a couple at a time, or what would you like to do? That sound okay?
Yes.
Great. So here.
In fact, if you have a question, my suggestion is stand up, because it's hard to see in this, it's hard to see. So if you have a question, stand up, please. Okay. And you see her.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for the fascinating talks. My name's Ahil. I'm a final year medical student here at King's and master's graduate. The question I had for you, Professor Sir Marmot, was you mentioned at the start of your talk looking at addressing inequity as a moral reason to act rather than a financial one, which I completely agree. But my question is, how do we frame that to policymakers and politicians when measurements such as the GDP don't even consider important factors such as well-being and the health of a society?
Well, it's a very important question. I think we need to be honest about this. A senior advisor to the Treasury said to me once, I described to him that I'd gone, in fact, to number 10, Downing Street, and trying to get number 10 to take on board what I was talking about, health inequalities. And the health advisor at number 10 said, yeah, but have you done a cost-benefit analysis?
Oh.
And a senior advisor to the Treasury said to me, if the government doesn't want to do something, they ask for the cost-benefit analysis.
Yes.
If they want to do it, they don't ask. In Parliament today, did you hear about the cost-benefit analysis of taking draconian measures against potential asylum seekers?
No.
Did we have a cost-benefit analysis about sending military assistance to Ukraine, to invading Iraq? Is there a cost benefit? No, absolutely not. If the government wants to do it, they don't ask if it contributes to the economy, they do it. So it's actually a fiction that we've got to make the economic case. Yeah, the Treasury's got their book, you know, that you've got to show it, but they ignore it if they want to do it. And that's why I'm not going to buy into this fiction that we've got to make the economic case, otherwise no one will take us seriously. They don't take it seriously anyway. So let's go right from what we believe in about the moral case and argue from there.
And to build on that, I would say, in the same way, people will make you, like, show me that racism exists. So we develop measures of racism, when we do all these studies and we're documenting the impacts of racism on health, that's because they're trying to stop us from intervening. So I would say the most important kind of research we need right now is intervention research on the conditions of people's lives, as you said, but recognizing that the distribution of the conditions of people's lives is not accidental. So we have to get to root causes, and we have to address who's at the decision-making table and who's not when they're deciding how we're going to intervene. But we need to do intervention research, which is not going to have the 3-year or 5-year fix. It's going to be a generational thing. We can enrich the soil right now for a flower that's already been in poor soil, and it might grow up another 1/4 of an inch, but it's not until it drops its seed into that rich, fertile soil in the next generation that you'll see the real impact. So we have to go from documenting cost-benefit analysis, does racism really exist, to intervening. And then that's and having the moral basis of that, and then understanding that we will measure outcomes, sure, but what we're really measuring is the quality of the soil. Have we really enriched the soil, and are we sustaining the enriched soil for that generation?
And let me give you an example. And I've written about this, I was talking to a Minister of Health in Ireland, and she said, I want to spend my money where it'll do the most good. And she was thinking about healthcare. And I said, spend it on the middle classes. She was shocked. I said, well, that's what the evidence shows. For a given quantum of expenditure, you'll get more health improvement if you spend it on people who already have a high degree of advantage. Cancer survival, survival from heart disease, and so on. She said, I thought I couldn't push this too far.
Because she was going to do it.
Her tolerance for this was not, it's all very well having a Socratic dialogue in a teaching session, but I'm talking to the Minister of Health. And she said, but that's not what I came into politics to do. I came into politics to benefit the disadvantaged. I said, you have an equity principle, not just an efficiency principle. And that's an important principle. So we need to balance. Now, it's very rare for me to quote a Chicago economist, but Jim Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning Chicago economist, says that investing in the first year of life to improve early childhood is the rare example where equity and efficiency come together. So start right at the beginning. And whether we're dealing with different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups, start right at the beginning. And that's the one place where you can genuinely make the good economic case.
Yes? Oh, sorry, the next.
Who has the mic?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. Hi, my name's Ragesh Udarawan. I've been a sexual health and HIV doctor for over 15 years now and a mixed methods researcher. And I, along with some colleagues here, have been doing work around racism and sexual health and HIV. And I think for me, something that Professor Jones said really stuck with me about social inequalities continuing to exist due to indifference and inaction. And I think the first thing that came to my mind is this because it's a willful inattention, willful ignorance, and thinking about some of the work that we've done and how static things can be when you're trying to persuade people to take action. Essentially, it's about people giving up power, and how can we get people to give up power and to care?
So you have to change the people who have the power. honestly, so anti-racism in my mind has 3 steps, and they're sequential. The first is to name racism, because you have to name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But then you have to go beyond naming racism to action, as I just said. The second of the 3 steps is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? So you can do some landscaping, identify fertile levers for intervention, targets for action. I'm going to come back to that second step. That's the third step after you've done that landscaping is then to organize and strategize to act, because of course we each do have individual power and wheelhouses, but collective action is real power. It informs us, inspires us, propels us, protects us. Now, I said I'd come back to that second thing. How is racism operating here? That's a good question, right? You notice, to the first question too, I didn't say, is racism operating here, right? We don't start with, is racism? That is a trick bag that you can get. Yes, racism, our countries, the two that I'm, US, UK, racism is foundational in our nation's history and wealth. In the UK, you could put it the other way, foundational, your wealth and history. They're all intertwined, right? So how is racism operating here? You ask that by looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And I just gave 2/3 of you guys a headache. Structures, policies, practices, norms, values, what are you talking about? I feel that way too until I recognized that those are actually the elements of decision making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And I charge each of you all henceforth, when you find yourself at a decision making table or set one, to look around and say, well, who is not here, who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job in the short term might be to represent their interests, but in the long term, your job is to create space, to find them a way to the table. So if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision making, quickly, policies are the written how of decision making. Practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision making in different time scales. Harder to measure what's not written, but practice is just watch me, you'll see how we do things. Norms, deeply embedded over time in how we expect you to do things going forward. Values are the why. Now, why did I say change the decision makers? Because who's at the table affects what's on the agenda and also brings the values. It's so important. So now how do you do that political power, right? So I'm not trying to cajole anybody. Also on the step about the children, I entirely agree with investing in the children. The other part about investing in the children is we have to interrupt what I describe as the intergenerational transmission of racism denial. So I talk about letting some people age out. Right? I don't have time to change their minds, although I would like to meet these people. Okay? But what we need to do, so with my allegories, I want to do children's books and stuff, but all of us have ways of interrupting the intergenerational transmission of racism denial, as we're also investing in opportunity structures and the like. But yeah, I mean, the quick answer is power to change who's making the decisions.
Yeah, I think there was a question over here as well.
And then he's
then the
asking
internet,
Liz.
Yeah, I was just trying to continue with what was being already said. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, but put it closer would make it nicer.
Oh, okay, all right. As far as I'm concerned, I've been working in health for a very, very, very long time, both practically as well as teaching in various universities, is that thinking of health as a moral issue is very difficult to convince because the moral issue in the sense that different political parties have different kinds of moralities. So morality means it is not something that you can convince the Tory party versus the Labour Party versus the Green Party, for example. So that's why if we say, if we talk about morality, and then it is a very soft advocacy. And secondly, if we talk about purely in terms of economics, then again, you have said that what are the problems with that. But I consider health as a right. Everything has to be a right. Childcare is a right. Women have certain rights. Once we talk in terms of, once we talk health as a right, for example, then it's very easy I'm not saying easy, but it becomes it becomes our right. That means it will go to the parliament. That means you can enact laws. That means there will be institutions. There would be regulations, and everything revolves around it. So I think that it's not an economic issue, or it's not a moral issue. It is a moral issue, obviously. Right and morality are very intertwined. But also, I think we have to look at the health as a right, which is, I think, in UNHCR is just one person looks after it, for example. And WHO doesn't consider health as a right. It's considered as an access issue. So it's a kind of, so WHO also doesn't consider, I worked for WHO for a long time as well, but the point is that it doesn't consider health as a right, neither is UNHCR. So I think if we make health as a right, I think that's the right way to go. Sorry.
Well, let me pick up your general point about people's view of morality may be different, and I agree. And if they're people of good faith, it's a big if today, but if they're people of good faith, then we can have a genuine discussion. So, for example, if I show somebody the social gradient in health, the greater the deprivation, the worse the health. It's almost like a Rorschach test. People on the right politically would say those poorer people don't know how to behave. They're ignorant. I shouldn't say it in a way that, I shouldn't caricature it. There's a view that health is a matter of individual responsibility, and if people don't have good health, they've got no one to blame but themselves. And a view on the left is they look at the social gradient and they say it's social determinants of health, it's society, and so on. Now, I think these are two legitimate prior positions to take. My own view is a really naive one, which is we could introduce evidence. And evidence might actually help the argument. So there's a graph that I've been showing ad nauseam, we had in my 2020 report, that for people in the lowest decile of household income, to follow the healthy eating advice, they would have to spend 74% of household income on food. So to those politicians who say, I could live on 30p a day, they're ignorant, they're lazy, they don't know how to cook, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard this so often. I say, this is what the data show. For people in the top 10% of household income, to follow the healthy eating advice, they'd only need to spend 6% of their income. Now, I would say to the guy on the right, you're absolutely right. This is a matter of personal responsibility. If those parents in the top decile feed their children bad food, they've got nobody to blame but themselves. They should exercise more personal responsibility. But people in the poorest decile, they've got the money. They have no cash. They can't buy food. We know 1 in 4 families with children in Britain has food insecurity. I tweeted a link to a Guardian story about certain supermarkets are hiding milk formula.
What?
Hiding it because people are stealing baby milk. Can there be a worse statement about where we are? Who are you going to blame? So if you've got a moral view that says it's all up to the individual, and people are having to steal baby formula because they can't feed their babies, and the supermarkets are having to hide it. Wow. So I hold the naive view. I respect people to have different moral positions. That's the way it is. But my naive view is we can start to adjudicate between these different moral positions with evidence. That ought to be part of the story. So, and I mean, I'm willing to say all this in Camara's presence, but you know, I've seen US data where if you present to a sample of the population a particular policy and you say, this is to help poor people, then you get a certain approval rate. If you present the same policy and say, this is to help black people, the approval rate plummets. Well, that's racism. That's, you know, that's the evidence that that people are not being moral here now. They're saying, if you're not like me, I don't want to do anything for you.
And furthermore, those policies that they even judge to be to help people of color, when they don't support them, they're going against their own interest. But that racialized view of things so blinds them that they don't recognize that they're closing their own hospitals when they don't pass Medicaid expansion, all of that. But I just wanted to, so this rights-based thing, I think that's very interesting. So in the US, health is not a right. In the UK, what? No. It's not a right. So healthcare at the NHS, which they're trying to make that not a right too. But in the UN, you know, Charter, health is a right. So that's a good place to start. I mean, I think rights-based, then if you can put that in place, then you don't have to care about economic, moral, any of it, right? So have people been organizing? Have you been organizing around that for like a long time? Or are there other people behind you to make health a right in the UK? There have been people in the US from time to time, but you know, I mean, we're worse. We don't even have a national health system. Right. Anyway, I would just say that. You're not an activist. But I found that very useful. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so this has been such a rich conversation, and indeed, we're already over time, which is crazy. But I do want to take a question online and another question as well. And as we also do want to have a chance to talk with each other informally over reception as well. But if you could bring a mic to Liz for that. So for someone in the internet, yeah, and then Young will.
This is working, yeah. So there's tons of questions online, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but I'll ask a few questions that are sort of in the a general cluster. And so this is about measurement and research around racism and health. So one question is, how would you recommend measuring race and racism in countries where asking about race and ethnicity is improper? And a related question is, how should whether or not there should be data gathered on individuals based on race, given the conversation. Another question, which is somewhat related, is with population health interventions, would you encourage certain targeted approaches for different groups? Because this person gives an example of those with Black ethnicity have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, and those with South Asian heritage have a higher risk of certain cardiovascular diseases. So. I felt that those three were generally related.
I didn't get the point of the third question, I'm sorry.
How to think about race and encouraging certain targeted approaches for different groups, because there are racial disparities that are seen in those particular conditions.
Okay. So I'll go backward. So targeting approaches, as long as you understand that race is operating as a risk marker and not a risk factor for that disease, so that it's marking something about how opportunity is structured, values assigned, something that has made that group have more of the diabetes, as long as you don't put the diabetes in the blackness. Because if you say these people have more diabetes because they're Black or they're Asian or whatever they are, then you can't change their Blackness or Asianness or something. You can just screen for diabetes and then treat. So the real thing is to use it as a risk marker, and you target the interventions there, but the research should be why. And that gets, we need to ask serial whys, all of us. We need to ask, we observe something, we say why, and then we get an answer, and then we say why again, and that's how we get to identify root causes as opposed to accepting, superficial explanations, and it's only in addressing root causes that will really make the change. We need to urgently address root causes. We don't need to urgently address low-hanging fruit. We don't need to prune the weed, we need to get it at the root. So that's for that one. Yes, we need to continue collecting data on race as long as there are racial disparities, either in outcomes, like health outcomes or economic outcomes or anything, or in opportunity structures. But we have to be clear that when we're measuring race, if we want to measure social class or culture and or genes with that, that's fine. But that we're not using it as a proxy for something. We need to explain how we're measuring race, and we need to always try to explain race-associated differences and go beyond just documenting them to thinking, well, let's try some kind of intervention, recognizing that's going to be probably spanning generations. And then measuring racism in a place where you can't say the word racism, well, you know, here we are. Here we are in the US for a while, but I and other people in my generation have softened things up, right? And so now the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released its first consensus study with the word racism or anti-racism in the title just on February 14th. I was part of that committee, but it was advancing anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM organizations beyond broadening participation. Would the National Academies of Sciences ever done that 40 years ago? No. The NIH, our National Institutes of Health, like your Medical Research Council and all of the different funders, is funding these things now. It is going to take getting in the trenches and not letting up. It is going to take persisting, passing the batons to those who are behind you, bringing in younger people, intentionally mentoring younger people and keeping up. The minute that we stop our anti-racism work, then we have to anticipate the pushback or whatever. So it's to start, and when you want to do that, you have to start by naming racism. So I know those were really quick, but yeah, thank you.
Did you want to add anything?
Well, just to add a couple of things. I mean, one, we're only just starting to do the measurement work in Britain. The Race and Health Observatory is trying to get it on the agenda. The Office for National Statistics is right now trying to produce data, and they did very swiftly during the pandemic on mortality data for different ethnic groups. And there's a real debate, and Camara, what she said refers to it. As you know, in this country, people have talked about BAME, Black and Asian Minority Ethnic Groups. And as I think about that term, my first pass is, wait a minute, Bangladeshi people are really not very similar to Black Caribbean. And they're not very similar to African British. Why would you want to put it all together? On the other hand, if they're all subject to the same sort of racism because they look differently, you could see a case for doing it together. So what that suggests is we've really got to get our purpose clear. If we're really trying to understand etiology, I want to know why Bangladeshi children in poverty do better than white kids in poverty. Just having BAME doesn't help me understand that question. And what is it about being raised in a Bangladeshi family for a kid means they'll do better in terms of early child development and education than a white kid in poverty. So we need to understand that. But let me say one other thing. As some of you may know, in my 2010 review, I coined the term proportionate universalism. And I was trying to get away from targeting, the classic British approach, you target. So then if it's socioeconomic, you're poor and you're not poor. As we quoted, not original to us, a health system for the poor is a poor health system. An education system for the poor is a poor education system. So we want to get away from labeling, from targeting. On the other hand, some groups, whether it's socioeconomic, ethnic, whatever, have special needs. So the idea of proportionate universalism was universal systems with effort proportionate to need. To try and get away from, well, there's something wrong with you because of something about you, whether it's the color of your skin or your income or your education or something. We want, and the NHS does that. I mean, that's what it is in principle. It's a system available to everybody with effort proportionate to need, not defined on the basis of socioeconomic or ethnic characteristics, but clinical need, which is fine. I mean, I don't know about you, but if, if David Attenborough, after he made his last series at age 96, then got bird flu and succumbed, I doubt that he would say, damn, I paid my money into taxes for the NHS and I never needed the bloody thing all these years. It's damn, I wasted my money. He'd say, I've had a great life and, I died at 97 or whatever. Let's hope he goes on for another 15 years. But he wouldn't say, I paid money. I mean, it's effort proportionate to need. It's there for all of us all the time when we need it. And most of us would like not to need it most of the time. So effort proportionate to need. But I'd like to do that socially, ethnically, etc. Universal systems with effort proportionate to need.
So let's take just one last question and then give you a moment to kind of wrap up.
Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a midwife by background and a health equalities lead in the NHS. Thank you both so much for your talk. My question's mostly for Professor Jones. I'm really inspired by the way you use storytelling and allegory to talk about racism, and I think it's really impactful. But I feel like I've spent a lot of time wasted perhaps trying to size up where people are on their journey of racism denial to anti-racism, and I wondered what wisdom you could share with us about your experience of how to do that quickly.
How to sum up where people are and what they need?
How to assess where they are so that you can tailor your conversation to bring them up with you.
I start basic with everybody. I don't assume. I don't assume because, so honestly, right, I think that there are basic things that if we all, that I learn always when I tell my allegories and the people ask me questions, I learn. So I'm not always teaching, but I'm presenting these stories as something that's now in the middle of the room for all of us to poke at and to enhance. And so I don't try to do that. I start with, we need anti-racism as a process, name racism, ask how it's racism operating, organize and strategize to act. Once you've done those things once each, are you done? No. It's sequential, but it's also looping, iterative. You need to name racism again still, because people say, oh, that was so 2020. You need to ask, how is racism operating here? Again, hopefully you have more people with you, but also people may have come and undone the things that you addressed. You need to keep organizing and strategizing to act, and so it's sequential, iterative, looping, right? And it may have to span generations. So that's the first core. The second is the 4 key messages that I told you. Racism exists. Racism saps the strength of the whole society. Racism is a system in between there, and we can act. And so I decide everybody finds these grounding things useful, and then everybody can add. So I don't try to say, oh, this one's advanced. Because you might be advanced in some knowledge or some things, in which case, please help teach, right? But all of us have something to learn. I have something to learn, all of us. So I think I think we're all in the journey. And as long as we keep moving and we move together, I think it's good.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry to cut off the questions here, but I would like to invite each of you to say some closing comments.
You want to go first or last?
I'll go last.
Okay. So I have 3 things I want to say. I love the proportionate universalism. It echoes with what I have distilled as 3 principles for achieving health equity, which are valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. And so it just sounds very, like, nicely jiving. I wanted to say, not that anybody brought this up, but a lot of times people in the US at least, who are white and poor, say, don't talk to me about white skin privilege. I'm poor. So I want to be clear that white skin privilege does not protect you from poverty or homophobia or a whole bunch of things, but it does give you benefit of the doubt, high expectations, relative safety in police encounters, an expectation of your full humanity so that one mistake doesn't damn you, the whole person, and many other things. So I just wanted to say, and in relation to that then, that the definition of racism that I shared with you all can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So what is sexism? That is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many axes of inequity operating in our societies today, intersecting in communities and in individuals. I acknowledge all of that. So social class markers, for example, or relation to the means of production are the things that that are related to social class. I think of social class as an outcome, and I think those others as the axes of inequity. But anyway, that's a longer conversation. But then when people say, well, Dr. Jones, you just talked for an hour about racism, and now you're saying you recognize all this other stuff going on. What's up with that? Here's what's up with that. I believe all of us need to at least be actively anti-racism, and I don't say anti-racist, because if you say anti-racist, people might hear you and go, oh, is she talking about me, right? No, we're talking about a system. I think we need to all be at least actively anti-racism, even as we address these other struggles. Why? Because racism is foundational, was foundational in my nation's history and wealth. Racism was foundational in your nation's wealth and history. Yet many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. We all need to be at least actively anti-racism, even as we engage around these other struggles, and to the extent that we're able to dismantle the mechanisms of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well. And then I just want to rattle off 7 things. I'm not even going to say a word than 7 things. These have to do with something that came up, I don't know, from you and others. 7 cultural or societal barriers to achieving health equity. Our narrow focus on the individual, our ahistorical stance, our endorsement of the myth of meritocracy, our endorsement of the myth of a zero-sum game, our limited future orientation, our endorsement of the myth of American exceptionalism, which I understand there's also a myth of British exceptionalism, and finally, but first and foremost, really, white supremacist ideology. Like if I had 2 more minutes, I would go into them, but anyway, those are 7 barriers, cultural or societal barriers, that are barriers to achieving health equity. 4 of them are the roots of racism denial. The narrow focus on the individual, racism is a system, what system? System, schmistem. Ahistorical stance, acting like the present we're disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage was just a happenstance. Myth of meritocracy, if you work hard, you'll make it. Well, yeah, most people who have made it have worked hard, but there are many others working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field. And white supremacist ideology, this false idea that there's a hierarchy of human valuation by race. There is not. But the false idea that not only is there such a hierarchy, but that white people are at the top as the ideal or the norm, that has made many people who are living as white in the United States, given them a sense of entitlement. It's resulted in the devaluation and dehumanization of people of color. And in my country, it has resulted in the fear at the browning of America that has resulted in our political divide today. So thank you very much for your questions, and then on to Michael.
Well, I'll approach my final comment from a very different direction. I started with a question I said commonly I get asked, which is, what's the one thing you'd recommend? A second question that commonly I get asked is, why aren't you morbidly depressed? You've been pushing these arguments for decades, and no one's listening. How do you keep going? I don't know if they look at the bags under my eyes. counter that by, I'm hopeful. What's wrong with you is the next question. How can you be hopeful? When I produced my 2010 review, A Fair Society, Healthy Lives, Coventry declared itself a Marmot city. They said, we're going to take your 6 domains of recommendations that I summarized briefly, and we're going to make them the basis for city planning in Coventry. So then I went to Manchester, and I talked to Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, and I said, Coventry's doing it. But if Manchester did it, that would be really something. He said, okay, come and advise us. And we did a report, Build Back Fairer in Greater Manchester. Then I went to Liverpool and said, do you know what they're doing in Manchester? So we did a report, Altogether Fairer in Cheshire and Merseyside, and then Lancashire and Cumbria. I was at a meeting with the mayor of North of Tyne Combined Authority, and I said, you know, we've been working with the mayor of Greater Manchester and Liverpool. The next morning, I get a phone call from the mayor's office in North of Tyne, Newcastle, and we're now going to be working with North of Tyne. Then Leeds said, we'd like to be a Marmot city. Then Gwent said, we'd like to be the first Marmot region in Wales. And then Gordon Brown, remember him? When we used to have intelligent politicians. No, they didn't say. Gordon Brown invited me to Kirkcaldy, where just north of Edinburgh. And he mentioned Fife. And I said, the Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? I learned Macbeth at school. Gordon then quoted from Macbeth and explained that when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, there was a Stuart king it was very political. But this man, the scholarship just comes out of him endlessly and effortlessly. And he said, you know, Fife is a kingdom. It's still the kingdom of Fife. I'd like Fife to be the first Marmot kingdom. I quite like this idea. And then he's got a think tank, Our Scottish Future, said we need a network of Marmot cities in Scotland. I was in Palermo a month ago because we're trying to get a network, I don't want to call them Marmot cities in Italy, but a network of socially sustainable cities in Italy. I'm really excited. I'm not morbidly depressed. People are taking these ideas and running with them. And the reason for working with cities and regions is twofold. There's a negative reason. If the national government won't do it, can't do it, isn't interested in doing it, then we've got to work at a different level. I'm not going to bang my head against a wall. But the positive reason is at the city and regional level, they're much closer to the reality of people's lives. And it's a question, you know, if national government is increasing child poverty, what can you do at city and regional level? It's an important question. And in a way, that's the question that underpins all our work with our network. But it's really exciting to see people striving every day to make a difference. It gives me hope. And in fact, a colleague gave me a book of essays by Raymond Williams. And on the cover of the book, he said, the truly radical thing is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing.
So much for ending on a note of hope, which animates a lot of my own work as well, and is just really inspiring. And I think that you've given us, both of you, a lot of hope. And I hope that all of you will stay and join us for a reception just outside, and look forward to being in continued conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.